I'm going to introduce some terminology. The distinction in particular between encoding, markup and annotation, which are three different things, but we can actually use XML for all of them in ways that I will introduce. Then I will give you a little bit of history about what kinds of annotation were being, what kinds of schemes for encoding, annotation and markup and all the rest of it were being used before we had XML and how they kind of led to XML arriving. Then we'll talk a bit about how XML actually works. So this is the practical bit. So if you ever find yourself needing to do XML encoding, then that's the bit that will be useful to you. And I'll say a little bit about the major XML standards for corpus work, which are TEI and the XML corpus encoding standard. I will spoil the ending. I'm not a big fan of them. Finally, I will suggest a modest approach to XML markup that I prefer. Moving on from that, we'll talk about how you might use XML in a corpus analysis. That is not just to construct a corpus and to encode it, but to actually do research on the corpus. So that's what we're going to cover in the next 2 hours. I don't have a clear break point, so what I'll do is when I'm sick of talking for a while, I'll just stop and say, questions? And then we can all have a little bit of a breather. Right. So, how many of you have never heard of XML before you saw it on the program? Not many, which is kind of illustrative of how important things like encoding has become, that even people who don't spend a lot of time building corpora, and even people who don't work with XML a lot, which is, I assume is true of most of you, have heard of it and know and have kind of gathered from reputation that this is important. And the reason it keeps getting mentioned is because it has multiple uses in terms of structuring corpus data and letting us do things with corpus data. First of all, it has a role when we are building the corpus. XML is now the preferred way of expressing aspects of corpus markup, which I'll discuss in a minute. And it is also now one of the preferred ways, if not the preferred way, of representing analytic annotation that is applied to the corpus. Before I go any further, let me deal with some of these terms like encoding and markup and annotation, which for me are very separate things, but I'm aware that some other people treat these things as being kind of synonyms. So let's clear up some terminology. When I talk about corpus encoding, I'm talking about what it says there, right? The process of whatever it involves from the beginning of you collecting a text that you want to put into a corpus until you are finished with the corpus text that you want to release. That is encoding, right? Everything that is involved in getting the original text in the wild into the text that exists, into the text as it exists in the corpus. Now, if you are starting from a printed text, that might include scanning or optical character recognition. It includes issues like choosing your character encoding. And if you don't know what character encodings are, then find out before you build a corpus, because it matters. I don't have time to talk about it today, however. It includes designing the markup, which I'll talk about in a minute. And it also includes things like working out how you are going to express your markup and how you're going to express annotation. This term markup, moving along, is when extra codes of some description are added to the raw text of a corpus file to represent features of the original text other than just the words. So let's take a really obvious example. Imagine you are adding a written fictional short story to your corpus, and that in this short story some of the words are in italics, right? They're emphasized by being put in italics. Well, if you just have a plain text corpus which does not include any markup, then those italics will be lost, because that's a feature of the original text that's not the words, right? And plain text can only ever actually capture the letters and the words they make up. If you want to keep the italics, and of course the italics might be linguistically important, the emphasis might be crucial for the analysis of those texts, then you are going to have to indicate that by some kind of code added to the plain text. And anything of that sort, anything that you add to preserve features of the original text, other than just the words, counts as markup. And here is a list of examples of the sort that you might see. You can see that the ones that you get in written corpora are slightly different from the things that you would want to mark up in spoken corpora. In spoken corpora, it's often things to do with like utterance boundaries, or when utterance boundaries don't work so well and you get overlap, that's often marked up. Non-linguistic noises, other kind of prosodic features sometimes, like pauses and so on. Sometimes you get anonymization of names if it's a spoken corpus that has been collected from casual conversation and people say their names, you might want to anonymize that. That's a feature that is not the original text, that is not part of the words of the original text, so that counts as markup as well. Whereas in writing, it's often things to do with how chunks of the text relate to one another. So you have chapters of a book and then paragraphs in a chapter and headings that are different from normal paragraphs and so on and so on and so forth. Are you familiar with this idea of markup and of these kinds of features being preserved in a corpus text? Okay, so that's markup. And the point of doing this is so that we can actually use it in the analysis. So, for example, you might consider whether the word new serves a different discourse function when it's in a section heading as opposed to when it's in some paragraph tucked away in the middle of a section. You could well imagine that it might. Well, how would you do that? You're going to have to find examples of the word new in headings. And unless you have the codes in there for headings such that you can search for them and pull them out, then you're not going to be able to do that analysis other than by hand. So markup is interesting there. The word the only at the start of a paragraph, again, similar thing. You know, if the word the comes at the start of a paragraph, then presumably it's carrying over some definite entity from a previous paragraph. This might be interesting for the study of how, you know, reference are preserved through the discourse. You know, you can see how the markup feeds through to interesting questions that you could ask depending on particularly what you're interested in. Come on. There we go. Annotation, I consider markup to be this sort of thing that I was just talking about. Annotation is when you are adding a layer of analysis of some description to the corpus. Right? Now, the line between markup and annotation can be fuzzy sometimes, particularly when it comes to things like phonetic transcription. Is that a feature of the original text, or is it an analytic interpretation? You could make an argument for both. But we'll treat them as separate, even though there are these fuzzy cases. So, annotation then is material added to the original text, which is not part of the original text, does not reflect features of the thing that you gathered. Rather, it reflects and records the results of an analysis that you have done on the language of the corpus. Now, the paradigmatic case study of analytic annotation is part of speech tagging, because it's very commonly done and it has a huge pile of uses. So when people say annotation, it's part of speech tagging that often pops to mind. So for those of you that aren't familiar with part of speech tagging, which I hope is few of you, oh dear, I've gone backwards. The general principle of part of speech tagging is that we assign a label of some sort to each word that indicates what grammatical category it belongs in. So determiner, noun, verb, preposition, determiner, noun. If you count articles as a subset of determiners, which some tag sets do and some text sets don't. But there are actually many other forms of annotation. Now, I'm not going to launch off on a lecture about annotation. The point is that just like the markup, if you are going to insert these things into the text, you will need to have some way of doing so, right? You need to have some way of putting them in, indicating that they are what they are, and keeping it separate from the original text. So yes, I keep markup and annotation very separate according to those definitions there, which summarise what I was just saying. You will find some writers who kind of treat them as synonyms and also use the term tagging to refer to any of them, but I like to keep the usage separate. So as I say, if we are going to have markup and if we are going to have annotation, then we are going to need to incorporate them into the text. But how? Well, as you might imagine, there have been lots of solutions proposed over time. Before we move on to examining some of those historical solutions, we have to mention the third thing, which is metadata. And the three things are basically cousins: markup, annotation, metadata. The term metadata simply means data about data, and in a corpus, the actual text, the language, is the data. So any information about those texts, their provenance, authorship, if it's a spoken text, who's speaking, features of the person who's speaking, that sort of thing, this is all metadata. And traditionally we tend to gather this metadata together and put it at the start of a corpus file. So the metadata is stored together with the actual text itself in a single computer file. That's why you will often hear the term file header or corpus header or text header used to refer to this blob of metadata that characterizes the text. So again, if you're going to put metadata into the actual file itself, you need some way of indicating this and some way of showing that it is, not part of the actual text. So we have plain text corpora still, and there are many kinds of investigation you can do with no markup, no annotation, no metadata, just plain raw text. I will mention later a way in which plain text can still cause problems, but if all you need is plain text, then fine, brilliant, you don't need to worry about it. But if you do need any of these other things, if you do need to keep track of metadata, or you do need to keep track of some of the things that we mark up, or if you do want to put in layers of analytic annotation, then that's the case where you're not going to be able to get what you need with the plain text raw corpus format. Therefore, we need another format. And whatever format we use, as I say, is going to have some special system of codes to embed the markup and annotation into the text.